Hallo, hallo.
Vi får lyd.
Hallo. Hei, hei alle sammen. Velkommen hit. Vi skal ha et seminar i dag om ulikhet. Mitt navn er Jesper Simonsen, og jeg er områdedirektør i Forskningsrådet. Det vil si, vi har delt Forskningsrådet inn i en del områder, og jeg har ansvar for det som har med ikke helse så mye lenger, det hadde jeg frem til mens vi planla dette møtet her. Så har jeg digitalisering, utdanning, kompetanse i samfunnet, velferd, arbeidsliv, migrasjon og en hel masse andre ting. Så jeg gleder meg til dette.
Ja, og mitt navn er Ruth Astrid Sæther, og jeg har da gleden av å skal være møteleder her i dag. Og jeg har jo lyst til å spørre Jesper, som jo er verten vår, når Forskningsrådet da inviterer til en konferanse om den nye ulikheten, hvordan definerer dere i Forskningsrådet begrepet ulikhet?
Ja, i dag er det jo sosial ulikhet som står i sentrum, altså fordeling av økonomiske ressurser og sosial kapital. Ulikhet handler om mye annet, men la oss konsentrere oss om dette. Og så ser vi at ulikhet er noe som stadig flere blir opptatt av, ikke bare fordi man snakker om rettferdighet, men man snakker også om at det kan true samfunnsinstitusjoner hvis det blir for stor ulikhet.
Ja. Og det er jo fortsatt sånn da, at det er ganske små forskjeller i Norge per i dag. Og likevel så har vi nå gjennom høsten for eksempel, og en valgkamp, hørt tallet 100 000 om norske barn som lever i fattigdom i dag. Og det er et tall som også øker. Og jeg lurer litt på sånn, hvor mye vet vi egentlig om konsekvensene av økt ulikhet? Er det sånn at velferdsmodellen vår er under press?
Ja, velferdsmodellen er vel alltid under press, men det er jo det vi skal få belyst i dette møtet her. Altså, jeg må si at ulikhet har mange ulike fasetter da. Altså, mange er opptatt av hvor mange som er fattige, mange er opptatt av hva som skjer med de rikeste, som det også blir flere av ifølge nyhetene i morges. Ja. Og så er det mange som er opptatt av hva som skjer for det store flertall, hvor det kan bli litt mer ulikhet eller litt mindre ulikhet. Og det som jo er det viktige å tenke på, det er ikke om det er ulikhet, men hva dette kan føre til, og hva man kan gjøre med det. Og der har jo ulike politiske retninger, ulike strategier. Så da er det interessant å få vite hvilke tiltak som virker, for eksempel for at ulikhet ikke skal føre til utenforskap. Fordi det er jo virkelig truende. Og dette er også noe som regjeringen har satt på programmet, ved at de har en egen prioritering som heter samfunnssikkerhet og samhørighet, som jo nettopp sier at hvis det blir for stor ulikhet, så har vi litt for lite tillit og litt for lite lojalitet i dette samfunnet.
Og en del av det grunnlaget som politikken skal utarbeides på, er det jo forskerne som skal stå for. Og nå er det jo sånn at dette er et forskningsfelt som, jeg skal ikke si i større grad enn andre forskningsfelt blir gjenstand for politisk diskusjon, men det blir noe uansett det. Og innimellom så kommer det påstander om at forskerne tar feil. Er det sånn at de tar feil, eller er det bare det at man nettopp fordi man har ulike politiske retninger og verdier og føringer, at man også da tolker resultatene ulikt? Hvordan ser den dynamikken ut?
Ja, la oss håpe at forskerne også kan ta feil. Jeg tenker så at det man ofte diskuterer det om forskerne blander dette med sitt egne syn. Og det synes jeg for så vidt er en god diskusjon. Jeg mener det er ingen forskning som er uavhengig av hva forskeren mener. Forskeren velger hvilke problemstillinger de skal forske på, de velger hva slags metoder de skal bruke, og det er også for å eventuelt få frem ting som de synes er viktige i samfunnet. Men det som jeg synes må påligge forskerne, det er å være veldig stringent med hva man har funnet ut, og hva slags utsagnskraft det kan ha. Og der er det jo ofte en diskusjon om forskerne trekker for mye ut av det de sier, eller for lite, om de da knytter det til litt mer vidtgående politiske synspunkter. Da.
Hvordan kan man møte det da?
Nei, det er jo god forskningskritikk i samfunnet, og vi kan jo gjennom et sånt møte få belyst ulike resultater. Da. Og da må man jo stå for det man har, og dokumentere at dette finnes det godt belegg for i den forskningen man har gjort. Og det belegget bør man jo håpe på, det kan være en viss konsensus om at metoder og utsagnskraft det er noe man kan bli enige om. Og så kan man skille det litt fra om det skal brukes i den ene retning eller den andre retning. Og så er det opp til politikerne å trekke de politiske konklusjonene.
Og utarbeide tiltakene ut ifra det.
Ja, men jeg synes også forskerne bør være med på å utvikle forslag til tiltak, og ikke minst også forske mer på effekten av ulike tiltak.
Sosial ulikhet og har vært, og kommer helt sikkert til å fortsette å være, et ganske så viktig og sentralt og brennbart, ikke minst, tema fremover. Og jeg vet at ulikhet har jo vært en komponent i en del forskningsprogrammer som Forskningsrådet har hatt de senere årene. Men det sånn at, for dere har jo ikke et eget program på sosial ulikhet. Ligger det i kortene at det kommer noe sånt fra Forskningsrådet i den nærmeste fremtid?
Nei, det gjør det ikke. Men du kan si, vi har jo et program som ligger veldig nært mye av det vi snakker om nå, nemlig det programmet eller den satsingen som handler om velferd, arbeidsliv og migrasjon. Og veldig mye av du kan si, den samfunnsvitenskapelige forskningen knyttet til dette kommer jo der. Men det vi har sett i de senere årene, det er jo det at ting henger mye mer sammen enn det vi tror da. Og vi har jo helseprogram, vi har utdanningsprogram, vi har kompetanse. Altså velferd, arbeidsliv, kompetanse og helse henger jo så mye sammen. At hvis vi skulle på en måte lage et program for ulikhet og skrelle bort de andre tingene, så hadde det også blitt ineffektivt. Så vi har nå laget et system i Forskningsrådet der vi vil klare å ta opp litt sånne brede tematikker opp på tvers av de fagbevilgningene, eller de programbevilgningene vi har, sånn at vi kan få belyst det. Og det har vi som mål å få til på dette området også.
Ja. I dag så har dere jo invitert anerkjente forskere til å komme hit og, som du sa, opplyse oss og fortelle om sin forskning. Og jeg er sikker på at du gleder deg like mye som meg til å høre på dem, så vi skal vel egentlig bare sparke det hele i gang.
Absolutt.
Ikke sant?
Ja.
Da sier vi tusen takk til Jesper Simonsen så langt. Vi møter deg igjen senere. Litt praktisk informasjon, det må man alltid gi før man starter. Toaletter, det ut og ned trappa, og det blir pauser gjennom dagen, så dere får anledning til å ta turen innom der. Vi har en emneknagg for de som har lyst til å bevege seg i de sosiale mediene i løpet av dagen. Det den nye ulikheten i ett ord, så den det bare å bruke. Og vær aktive. Vi har 3 sesjoner her i dag. Og fordi vi har en utenlandsk foreleser med oss i denne første sesjonen, så skal jeg kjøre den på engelsk. Så da skal jeg skifte språk for en liten stund. During the entire conference, we would like for you in the audience to participate, to share your thoughts and to ask questions to the speakers in the panel discussions. Now, the way to do that here today, and please pay close attention now, is by using the interactive app or the website Slido. So you can see here, Slido. If you find your tablet or your mobile phone and open a browser, or you could enter an app store or the Google Play, you can download the app. And I'm looking at you, there's nobody moving yet, but I hope you're going to do that eventually. Because in this app, you will be asked to enter a code. And today's code it's a Norwegian word, ulikhet, inequality in Norwegian. And once you've entered this code, you will enter a forum where you can comment and ask questions, and everything in this forum is visible to anyone within. And here's the genius of Slido. Whenever you see a question that you think is relevant, you may click like. The more likes, higher the relevance, which increases the chance of me asking the question or conveying your message to the speakers. Because there will be no Q&A sessions after each speech, but I'm going to collect and save your input for the panel discussion. So please be active if you want to make your voices heard. And another important message, if you see that someone has posted a question that is more or less the same as the one that you wanted to ask, just click like on the existing question. That's a great help for me, so that I won't have to shuffle through 2 or 3 versions of the same question. And thirdly, obviously, please write your questions in English for this first session. Later on, you may switch to Norwegian if you prefer. Now, to our first speaker this morning. He is well known for his ability to ignite discussions and for being an original thinker with a sharp pen, to quote his wiki. As leader of the Center of Equality, Social Organization and Performance at the University of Oslo and a professor of economics at the same institution, Kalle Moene is not afraid to make his voice heard. Like when he writes that, and I quote, "What we produce and how we do it is essential to what social differences and class divisions we get. The market is like a democracy with an uneven right to vote." Quote unquote. Now, Kalle Mone is going to take us on a journey worldwide to argue why he thinks we're experiencing an international inequality crisis at the moment. So please give him a warm welcome, Kalle Mone.
I think it's appropriate to have the applause before I speak, because maybe there's nothing to applaud afterwards. So I will try to stick to what I promised to talk about, inequality as an international crisis. And I think it is a crisis for several reasons. But is this easy? There's a little bit echo here, but can you hear me okay? So I think there are several aspects of a crisis that fit into the inequality crisis. Normally we define a crisis as a big change or a big uncertainty, or you are vulnerable to certain things. Maybe these aspects only fits partially to the inequality crisis. But there's also an aspect of crisis that it blocks or hinders goals that we like to achieve. And in that sense, the international inequality is an international crisis, I would say. It's almost by definition. Why? Because we want to achieve equity. We want to achieve that every person have equal rights, equal worth. And since you have huge inequality, then you already have failed. So it's a crisis the more you have of it, because it blocks this common goal, I think, this shared from culture to culture, from country to country, that you would like to have equality in that broad sense of the word. And since economic inequality easily blocks this in several ways, it is a crisis in itself. In addition, I think inequality blocks something that we like to achieve of other things. For example, environmental concerns or global warming, climate change. All these things are very difficult to mobilize the world's population to sort of that we should share in sort of getting these things right, when the consequences of getting it right is so unevenly distributed over the population in the world. So there's a crisis in the sense that we don't live common lives. And since we don't live common lives, then we don't share in the faith of the planet to the same extent that we would have done if we were more equal. So it is a crisis for these collective goods that we would like to achieve for the world as a whole. And economic and social inequality, it's said here the new inequality, but no, there's a new equality and a new equality. It comes again and again. But it is chronic, maybe not the same persons all the time, but this is like a chronic inequality. So the new aspect of it, we can discuss a little bit, but I think it is old inequality in new and stronger form that we actually see. So this is my perspective on the thing. It is a crisis for these reasons. It's a crisis in itself, and it's a crisis because it blocks other things that we are very valuable for us to achieve. And it's very difficult to ask for collective rationality when the burdens and the cost and benefits of different policies are very unevenly distributed. And it must be when you have inequality of the type we have. Some people say that doomsday is coming. But for some countries, doomsday is already there and have been there for a long time for the majority of the population. And it's think about that as an example of how difficult it is to have shared beliefs when you have very different lives. And that is the perspective we're going to have. So inequality, of course, is not one number. Many people think that you can just pick a number. This is inequality. Inequality has many dimensions, and it's a social thing. It's a social relation that it captures social relations in society. And of course, there are many perspectives on that, depending on the questions that you ask. There's too much in the debate here that we just say that Gini went up so and so, and we don't talk about what we put into that Gini coefficient. So I will start with one feature of the international inequality by first reminding you that the birth lottery, say 150 years ago, was basically about class. The birth lottery said the country wasn't so important. Which country birth lottery turned out to give you didn't matter so much, but it mattered a lot which class you belong to in society. But since then, and particularly some of the new inequalities I guess they have in mind here, that countries matters much more. So countries now, still class or social groups matter a lot, but country matters equally much at least. And so this from class to geography, I think, is an important dimension in the inequality in the world. Many people will claim that inequality have gone down in the world because if you have one observation from each country and you weight these observations with the size of the country, then you get that the inequality across countries is declining, no matter how you measure it. I think a Gini coefficient would serve fine, and other indexes would also serve fine. But we know that the reason why it's going down is China and India, because there are high growth in these populous countries. So that means that these countries are catching up, and that is the reason why, basic reason why inequality across countries is declining. But if you look inside these countries, then inequality goes up within the country, within groups, across groups in India, across groups in China, inequality is rising tremendously. And so it's very mixed. Those who are the drivers of global reductions in inequality, as some people measure it, they have themselves increasing inequality within them. And I think that is a good picture to think about. So I wouldn't say whether inequality all in all, where each observation is one person, no matter where, I think that is not, at least not declining to the same extent. I don't think it is declining at all. But here, there's a little bit discussion how you should measure things, income or consumption and so on. I don't want to go into that. But if somebody is particularly interested, buy a beer. I speak for hours about it. Maybe more than one beer. Okay, but today is for free, so then no numbers. So let me motivate a little bit what I'm going to say by the emergence that my good friend and colleague Branko Milanovic had sort of emphasized the emergence of a global middle class. That is an interesting observation, but it is an emphasis on emergence. What does it mean? It means that those if you look at the income distribution across individuals for the whole entire world, those who are in the middle of that income distribution have high income growth. So that is the middle class basically in China and India. If you really are rough on numbers, that's driven by these observations. And then you have the middle class in richer countries. They have stagnated in their income. US is a typical example, that they have stagnated for years in the income growth of this imprecisely indicated group of the middle class. But then you have the super rich in rich countries. They have also had a high income growth. So you have the middle is increasing in the world, and the very rich, basically in rich countries, but also the rich in poorer countries are having a huge income growth. This is the main basic picture. But what people tend to forget, if you look at, this is the relative increase in income, the growth rates of the income. But if you look at the absolute increase in income, then all the increases are among the super rich. Because the others start, they have the same rate, a high rate of growth in income, but they start out so low that the absolute income that they command over is very low still. So then you have a very rising profile to the super rich, and they take the absolute gains. And I will just remind you that all income measures, inequality income measures, are relative, that you see here. I will put up one in the end that isn't. I will have one thing that you're going to see on the screen in the end of the talk. And so they are relative. That means if you double everybody's income in the world, everybody's income in the world, the big fraction of people in India that earns around 20 kroner a day, $1 to $2 a day, a big fraction of people in India, if you double their income, they go then from $2 a day to $4 a day. But the super rich, they go from 10 million per year to 20 million a year. The inequality measures recognize this as inequality is the same, no change, because it's just a relative measure. But all of us, I claim, all of us would have an intuition that say that, well, but it is a huge difference when the rich double their income because they start from such a high level. There are different things they can do that we are completely excluded from doing because of this increase. So you should just be aware of that the inequality measures, they underappreciate this moment, as I say. They have very little of absolute inequality. They have relative inequality, and that means that it's only the relative increase that matters for changes. And we can discuss how we should best do this. There are many specialists here. But I just wanted that you should notice this, that it's not a Gini coefficient, for example, it's just relative income. 9 to 10 gap is just relative income. Share of the 1% richest is just a relative income concept. All these things, therefore, you should translate over to absolute, and then the picture changes a lot. Then you see more of the crisis. You see more of the crisis that you live very different lives, and you have very different interests and very different beliefs, I guess, based on the ability for each of us to sort of cheat ourselves that what we think is good for ourselves is good for everybody, I think that's throughout the world. And when what is best for yourself is determined by your income to some extent, then you have often a very little collective rational elements in your policies, recommendations. Okay, that was a little bit of my strong views on these things, but I think they are worth keeping in mind. I'm just going to check with the time here how much I'm doing. Fine. 8 minutes left. So many people are also obsessed by poverty. Poverty is an important concept and one aspect of inequality. It isn't inequality, but it's one aspect of inequality. That means that you set a line, a poverty line, and you say that the share, for example, the share of the population that falls below this line, they are poor. So question, are this group of people, are they increasing or decreasing, or what's happening to that group? It would be an important aspect of inequality for any description of the crisis. Here it matters a lot where you set this line. So, for example, there's too much, in my view, and you ask for my views today, so this is what you're going to hear. In my view, there's too much emphasis on extreme poverty. Poverty similar to what you can buy for 20 kroner in Oslo City. So this is, if you're out of that, then you're not poor anymore. But nobody here, you can, if you like, test it. Live for 20 kroner a day for a couple of months, and we can, I give you 25, and then you're out of poverty, so now you're much better. So think about these things, because we are so used to these concepts that we don't understand what it means. But when they say we reduce reduce poverty in the world, then we are talking about people moving just above $2. But it's fine. It's much better to move above than to move from above, below. So we should celebrate it, but we should be a little bit more ambitious, I think, on behalf of poor people. In the rich world, so this number is going down when you measure it by this absolute sense. But in the rich world, then we measure it in a different way. Then we say it's 50% of the median income. And the median income is the income where you are 50% richer than you and 50% poorer than you. So 50% of that, that's a relative concept. This is what Adam Smith would say, that you should appear in public without shame. That must be something relative to the income. First, you should notice, if you apply this concept to India, and for example, then poverty disappears. Why? Because median income is itself very close to the poverty line. And if you take 50% of that, of course, then all poverty is gone, almost. So we have a definition of poverty in our own country that will eliminate poverty altogether by definition. And of course, when we talk about things, we use the same words about these things, then this is really self-handicapping. We don't quite understand what these words, what these numbers means. So then, when you have 50% of the median income, then countries that are small differences, like in this country still, then of course the median income, both rich and rather compressed income distribution, then the median is a high number. And you take 50% of that, then you still get a high number. So that means that you, by definition, almost by being egalitarian, get more poor people than you otherwise would have gone. Because the median is, the gap between the mean and the median is one indication of the inequality in the income distribution. The mean income is always higher than the median. Why? Because super rich people, they drag up the averages, but it doesn't affect the median. If they become richer, they are equally many, but they drag up the average. So that means the gap between the average and the median income could be one indication of it. And if this is small, then you by definition get many poor people. I mean, again, I have nothing against doing this, but you should know what we are doing. I think this is, we are alienated against what we are talking about. The final thing before I move to the announced graph they're going to have in the end, it's going to be a disappointing graph then, since that is, you can do the similar thing for rich people. You can say that there's a richness line. In the news today in Norway, there was a discussion of how many billionaires we have. Actually, the numbers in Norway are quite good that Capital collects. But it can't be used for international comparison because they are assembled in one specific way, better way than most others do. But it can't be used to sort of compare countries. But I think I said this before to maybe some of you. But if you take the number of billionaires relative to the population size, then an interesting picture emerges. Well, many people think that, US must have most. Not true. They have around 1.7, 1.8 billionaires defined by their wealth. You have at least 1 billion in wealth, US dollars, I should say. US dollars. So you understand, like, it is wealth to talk about. US have around 1.7, 1.8 billionaire per million inhabitants. You have to measure it relative to the population. Norway has around 2. Sweden has 2.4. So there's nothing in countries that like to talk about themselves as egalitarian. They can have many super rich people. If you move this richness line, it's a parallel thing to the poverty line. Richness line a little bit below 1 billion dollar, then the difference becomes much clearer. Then Norway has many, many more billionaires or super rich, they wouldn't be billionaire completely, than the US per million inhabitants. So we think of ourselves that we have a big upper class, compared to other countries. Maybe that is a consequence of having an egalitarian structure and more or less equal opportunities across social groups, that you get many rich people for that reason. So there could be something there. I don't want to discuss it. But you should just know it in the description of the international crisis. This is one part of the picture. India, China, has a huge increase in billionaires. And here's something interesting. Many people think this globalization driving the whole thing. India is studying more than China. India, the new billionaires in India, where do they come from? Sheltered industries, industries that are protected against competition. And that's because it's connections, it is privileges that make them super rich. So it is in the age of globalization, and maybe for some globalization matters, but it is the connection with the powerful that are important. So let me come closer to the end. The last aspect, I would say that it is an international inequality crisis. That is that inequality spills over to policies, and policies spills over to economic distribution of income, and this is can be very dangerous connections. It's very easily reinforcing. So now I can get my picture on there. It's a very strong reinforcing mechanism. I think I said this before, but I'm afraid I repeat words. But so there's slogans you can say that sort of the those who have the goal get the vote, get the rule, and those who get the rule, they get the gold. And this is how distribution of income affects policy, how policy affects or maintain the privileges of the rich. And you see this graph is sort of illustrating just a few connections. We call it, it's best in Norwegian, but I say it in English first. The Miser Index, this you, Tori Linn, and I sort of update this. So it's our personal measure of miserliness towards poor people in the world. And miserliness means that you have poverty in the midst of affluence. Where there are rich countries, for example, with a huge gap between the average income of the non-poor and the average income of the poor. There's a huge polarization between these two groups, treating all non-poor as one group. That is part of the measure. And we combine that with poverty measures. I don't go into details here, but it's those who are interested, yet another beer, and I'm ready. Here is just an illustration of the miserly development. In Norwegian, it's called Gini Index, and it's local Bergensk, because it's how miserly you are towards, and Gini resembles Gini, so it's a little bit. I think people should speak Bergen dialect, and it's easy. So this is development since 1990. This is the income of the world. That's the stipulate is called GNI. This is roughly said income per capita in the world. This Miser Index is a measure of failed redistribution. It is the presence of poverty in the midst of affluence, that you have a lot of income to redistribute, but you don't do it. The more you fail in this, the higher up on the curve here. You see the financial crisis, it looks like it becomes a little bit better. That's because the super rich are not so rich anymore because of the financial crisis you see around 2008 and so on. But now we are back to the new inequality is back actually to the old one. And this stipulated red line, that is the headcount measure of the share of world population below $2 a day. Around that. It's how do you translate the PPP process. So I know that I'm out of time, so I'm just going to say that to me, this is we do this for all countries in the world, and we rank countries. And which country is the most miserly country in the world? South Africa. Why? It's rich, but have way too many poor people. So many people say, oh, look at the failure of South Africa. But South Africa had exactly the same score on the Miser Index as the world as a whole. And of course, social attitudes across people shouldn't be bound by national borders. It should be throughout the entire world. And this measure, we are going accept the world as a whole, as the world's responsibility for the world's poor people is becoming more and more miserly. There's more and more resources to redistribute. It doesn't happen because there is a failure, and that is part of the international crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalle. I think there's a whole line of beers waiting for you for people who want to know more about this. And he's going to be back for the panel discussion, of course. We like to think of our own country as egalitarian, where everyone has equal rights and opportunities. Well, that may be a nice vision, but it's not necessarily the truth, our next speaker argues. She has studied several aspects of social stratification and economic inequalities. And she sees that there has been a shift in the debate around inequality, mainly linked to the distribution of wealth, and she's soon going to elaborate on that. Marianne Nordli Hansen is Professor of Sociology, also at the University of Oslo. And following up on Kalle Moene's speech, she's now going to give us an insight in the international inequality debate, linking it to the patterns that she finds in Norway. And I wonder, how does this affect our democratic system and the distribution of power? Well, you're going to give a nice round of applause to Marianne Nordli Hansen, and please continue to ask questions through Slido. Marianne Nordli Hansen.
Thank you. It's nice being here and see so many people interested in inequality. I'm going to follow up some of the topics that Kalle talked about, but I'm going to be a bit more short-sighted. So you'll also have the pleasure of hearing me in English. The inequality has become one of the most strongly debated topics around the world. There is widespread fear that trends of rising inequalities lead to weaker social cohesion and lower levels of well-being, and that they ignite social conflicts. I want to pay special attention to two rather recent features of the inequality debate. First, attention has gradually moved up towards the top of the hierarchy, as Kalle also talked about. And second, the distribution of wealth is higher on the agenda than previously. These features are evident both in economics and in sociology. In economics, among other things, with the works of Atkinson and Piketty, who showed the famous U-turn in the development of economic inequality, with increasing economic inequalities after around 1980. Piketty's book Capital became a worldwide bestseller, with a large impact also outside academia. One point is that it is not only or not primarily the labor market that creates inequality, but wealth accumulation and inheritance. Sociologists, on the other side, have renewed their attention towards elites, including economic elites. And since 2000, an increasing number of studies have investigated the consequences of wealth inequality. A major question in this field is, what does wealth inequality mean for life chances? That is, the chances to acquire material goods as well as a meaningful life. A growing number of recent studies, especially from the USA, they show associations between parental wealth and the level of wealth obtained by the children. But family wealth is also shown to influence education. This is understandable in USA, in a country with large inequality between school context and costly higher education. But this is also found in more egalitarian Sweden. So such findings, they are relevant for interpretations of what kind of societies we live in and where they are moving. For a long time, the dominating theory about social class and societal change was the so-called Modernization Theory. A main point in this theory is that the importance of ascribed characteristics, most importantly social class origin, for what you attain in life is decreasing and probably disappearing altogether. As David Grusky has written several places, this theory is dying and serves most as a straw person in studies of social change. However, the basis of this theory is that, the normative basis of this theory is that merit, that is ability and effort, should be the basis of rewards. I would argue that meritocracy still has strong support in the public at large and in institutional arrangements such as the queues to higher education. Then it matters, your grades matters, and that's all. Perhaps never has the value of education been emphasized so strongly, and competition in the education system has never been so harsh. If family wealth influences rewards not only in the form of wealth accumulation, but also in the school system, the hotbed of meritocratic values, this is a serious blow against the ideas about meritocratic reward processes. This also means that increasing inequalities of wealth have widespread and serious consequences. In this talk, I therefore want to address these questions. To what extent is the focus on the top, and more specifically top wealth holders, relevant in Norway? Then I go on to discuss the consequences of wealth inequality for life chances. At present, I'm involved in two projects financed by the Norwegian Research Council. One is about the modern working class, a sort of Brexit Trump-inspired project. The other is Paradoxes of Wealth and Class, Historical Conditions and Contemporary Configurations. And one of the paradoxes in this title is this. In a world of growing inequalities, Norway and Scandinavia may seem as tranquil havens due to egalitarian social policies and relatively low income differences. Simultaneously, as we heard, Norway has one of the highest proportion of millionaires per capita. 3 of the 7 richest people under 40 years old in the world, measured in 2016, are Norwegian heirs. And they still are on these world top wealth lists. This paradox is also evident when we look at comparative evidence of wealth inequality. One measure, as Kalle also said, there are several measures. They show somewhat different things, but we will still look at some pictures of this. The Gini Index, with the Gini Index, the inequalities are greater the measure. So according to these estimates, USA, as expected, has a high level of wealth inequality. But it may be more surprising that the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, are among the countries with the highest inequalities of wealth, with higher inequalities than, for example, UK, France, and Italy. An alternative way to measure inequality is to study concentration, how much wealth or income specific proportions in the distribution hold. For example, the top 1% or top 10%. If we focus on this top 1%, estimates from OECD indicate that they possess around 20% of all wealth in Norway. On the same level as UK, but somewhat above countries such as France and Spain. According to the estimates from Statistics Norway of Aaberg and Stubbhaug, their proportion of wealth has increased from about 15% in 1995 to somewhat above 20% in 2016. The top 10% own about 60% of total wealth. Here is just a picture of the increase. The growth of large fortunes is uneven across geographic areas. The first picture here starts in 1993 and continues up to 2012. The black dots is mean financial wealth in the smallest geographical units. That is grunnkretser, when the mean is above 1 million kroner. The larger the dots, the greater the wealth. We see that the dots increase sharply in size over time, but only in specific parts of Oslo and areas to the west of the city. And for you who deal with numbers like this is adjusted for inflation adjusted. So this is a picture of wealth accumulation during the last 3 decades. And this shows that during the last 20 to 30 years, what researchers have called the golden ghettos in the capital have developed. And indeed, my colleagues Ljunggren and Andersen have shown that the rich, they live more segregated from the rest than the poor do. In this context, I'm most concerned about the consequences than the causes. So I will only say a few words about the causes. Often noted explanatory factors are deregulation of credit and housing markets and changes in taxation. Norway has experienced economic growth since the early 1990s with the booming oil economy and surging property values, an environment that provides ample opportunities for accumulation. Moreover, large fortunes that have developed over time tend to grow rapidly. There is a so-called snowball effect. And as David Grusky probably will say something more about, the abilities to collect rents in top-level groups may have increased. Therefore, the rewards in top positions in the private and the public sector have increased. In the Norwegian bargaining model, the development of wages among different kinds of employees are followed closely and used in the bargaining between the organizations. There are no similar institutions monitoring the inequality of wealth. I think Kapital is the main monitor of wealth in Norway, so that's why we didn't really know so much about this until quite recently. NFR, this is just to look at, just to give a picture. This is a survey done by the Norwegian Research Council where people were asked how much wealth do you think the 10% top owns? I don't think the numbers are so important in detail here, but the main picture is I think that people are attentive of growing wealth inequalities, but they don't really know about the numbers. The researchers' numbers aren't fixed in the public consciousness. The next question is, why should we care about wealth concentration at the top? Is that really a problem? The main answer in the social sciences is that wealth concentration is important because wealth is a basis for power. Those who own large fortunes have the power to make economic decisions about investments and the like, with large consequences for others. But wealth may also give power to influence public opinion, for instance, by founding media corporations, supporting political parties, or think tanks targeted towards specific political goals. Top wealth owners may also influence societal development in other ways, such as the visual environment or what is presented in art institutions. Finally, and not the least, wealth gives you the power to help your children get ahead. You can help them get ahead, among other things, just by giving them money. Before we start looking at some results about the impact of wealth, some words about what wealth is very shortly. The most common measure is net wealth, which is the sum of financial wealth and real capital with debts deducted. Wealth may be hard to measure. One reason is underreporting, if you ask people what they own. If you rely on tax registers, a main problem is underestimation of wealth, which is most problematic among those who are rich. Because of measurement problems, there is an ongoing discussion about possible biases. Where does wealth come from? I would say there are two sources of wealth. You can save your own income, or you can get it from others through bequests when your parents or grandparents die, or inter vivos gifts. You get gifts while they still are alive. So let's look at the intergenerational associations of wealth. The wealth distribution is then seen as a ladder. What is focused is wealth rank, for example, percentiles, and not wealth per se. In this context, we look at wealth rank. The higher up you are in the distribution, the greater is your wealth. And we have done this for people between the age of 30 to 35 and their parents and grandparents. So this is an illustration of a model where the two lower lines refer to grandparents with low or medium wealth, the two top lines to rich grandparents near the top of the wealth distribution. And the lines, they show the estimates for young adults with similar levels of education and earnings. We have measured their earnings 6 years before their wealth is measured. So what do we see? The higher up in the wealth distribution your parents are, the greater wealth you have yourself. And young adults with rich grandparents, they have more wealth than those with poorer grandparents. You also see that there are small differences when parents are poor or medium wealthy. It is when the parents and grandparents are really rich you see the rise. So this means that it is not family poverty that drags you down the wealth ladder, but it's family wealth that pulls you up. So why is this so? I said before that there are two sources of wealth, saving and transfers from others. As this model illustrates in the figure, compares people with average income and education, saving of own income is not a likely answer. The obvious second answer then, that the pattern is caused by transfers or gifts or inheritance in the family. And that grandparents' wealth has an effect that illustrates the point I talked about before, that wealth can be accumulated over several generations. But are wealth transfers so common? Is it so common to give away wealth when people are relatively young, as in this picture? To answer this question, my colleague Øyvind Wiborg and myself have studied the register of bequests, that is inheritance and inter vivos gifts. We found that receiving gifts is quite common and in fact more common than bequests up to the age of about 45. After that, the parents die and then you get inheritance instead of gifts. But there is a large variation in who receives gifts and bequests. We have already looked at the impact of family wealth, according to now we can look at the social class. We see here that those originating in the economic upper class, that is owners and top managers and directors, they are especially likely to receive transfers, as well as large inter vivos gifts. Those originating in the unskilled working class are the least likely to receive transfers, and if they get something, they also get far smaller sums. In the rings, the red ring has 31,000 in mean gifts, or mean gifts and inheritance, but in the economic upper class, it is 425,000 kroner on average. But what about the very top? Here we see the origins of very rich and super rich people. They are between the age of 37 and 40 in the years between 1993 and 2010. So we can follow the development over time and see social change. So those in black at the top, they have parents in the 1%. They have the parents who are the 1% richest among the parent generation. At the bottoms are those with median wealth and lower. We see that the proportions with very rich people systematically increases, and especially so among those who are super rich. And this, I would say, would indicate that inheritance becomes more important over time. The consequence is that dynastic wealth increases. So we will follow up in the future if this tendency continues. I'll just say, as Kalle talked about, Kapital came with their lists today. If you look at the 10 richest people, they're rather old. Some of them are self-made. I think all this is changing. If you look down on the lists, there are lots of inheritors. And also those rich men on the top, they have very rich children who already are on these rich lists. So I think this is a phenomenon we are going to see much more of. We have also started to study the impact of family wealth on education, and the results, they indicate that wealth is important for educational attainment in Norway too, as it is in Sweden. So to conclude, what is the inequality pattern in Norway? This clearly is a paradoxical pattern. While income inequality has increased systematically over several years, the level is still relatively low. But wealth inequality is far higher and is increasing. For example, total financial capital increased between 2010 and 2017 with 76%. And those at the top, they own ever more of this sum. The results I've shown also indicate that family wealth is important for the attainment in the younger generation, and that inheritance is especially important at the top of the wealth scale, and among groups such as owners or managers. The majority of those who are rich at a relatively young age, they are clearly not self-made, but inheritors. So elite dynasties with extraordinary resources have been developed, and I think such patterns should be investigated closer in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marianne, and I'm looking forward to discussing with you in the panel later on what to do with this and how to deal with it, if necessary. It is always a pleasure welcoming American professors to Oslo, and maybe particularly today. David Grusky, Professor of Sociology at Stanford University, is also Director of the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality. And his research examines changes in the amount, the type, and the sources of inequality. Today, he will dwell into the claim that they have put opportunity on the market in the US. And then one question that pops to mind is, what are the consequences of this? And a second one is it desirable or even possible to reverse this commodification of opportunity? It is time to leave the floor to David Grusky, but please continue to ask questions. There's a lot going on at Slido at the moment, and I see there are many topics that we're going to touch upon later on today, so be patient, but keep on asking questions. But before you do that, please welcome David Grusky.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks for that kind introduction. I want to apologize from the get-go about imposing this particular language on you. It's very, very nice of you to do this for me. I feel a bit guilty, but I'll work through that. Okay, so let me start, and I think it's appropriate to start with the Pope. He tweeted about 5 years ago on the next slide, something that I can't now remember unless I see that slide. Inequality is the root, you'd think I'd remember that. Inequality is the root of social evil. I want to propose on the next slide a modification, an elaboration, a slight friendly amendment. I have that. That's wonderful. I'm in control. Okay. I want to propose a slight modification. I'm going to say that inequality is not the root of all social evil. I think this is consistent with what the Pope was intending. Not all social evil, but it's the combination of rising income inequality and rising marketization that's generating a lot of social problems, and in particular, it's generating a daunting mobility problem in the US. So, as a simple characterization of this mobility problem, I'm going to give you just one piece of evidence that will give you a sense of what I mean by the mobility problem in the United States. And so the question that I want to pose here is who gets into so-called Ivy Plus colleges? These are places like Harvard, Yale, Princeton, Stanford, the most elite colleges in the US. And you might ask, well, where are they recruiting from? Where in the parental income distribution are those elite colleges recruiting from? So you have on the x-axis here the parental rank as indexed by parental household income. So you can have on the left side at the very bottom of that parental income distribution, and then at the top you have the so-called 1%. And you might then ask, what proportion of students in these Ivy Plus colleges are coming from the 1%? It's 14.5%. And that is in fact slightly more than the proportion coming from the entire bottom 50% of the income distribution. That's 13.5% of students are coming from the entire bottom half of the income distribution. There's more students in these Ivy Pluses coming from the 1%. So that just gives you a sense of the mobility problem. And you might then ask why money matters so much. The answer that I'm going to put to you is we've put opportunity on the market. It's for sale. And in the US and in many countries, opportunity is supposed to be sacred. It's supposed to be available to children of rich and poor families alike. But what we do instead is allocate it to those who have money. So we put it on the market. You can basically put your money on the table and you'll get some opportunity for your kids. Now, how did this happen? Obviously, there's a neoliberal backdrop to this. It's a neoliberal commitment to put everything on the market, right, that carried the day. But it's not the case, I don't think, that we explicitly said in a top-down fashion in the US, let's put opportunity on the market. That's a wonderful idea, let's do that. I think rather we ended up where we are now through a series of small decisions, each of which had its own internal logic that perhaps made sense in light of an overall commitment to the market. But at the end of the day, we ended up where we are now, in which opportunity is wholesale in a full-throated way on the market. So I want to talk about how that happened by going through three zones in which this progressive marketization of opportunity played out. Zone 1, the early childhood. I'll talk about how we put opportunity on the market in that zone. Then I'll go to Zone 2, which is middle childhood. Talk about how that happened in the US. And then finally, Zone 3, early adulthood. And the idea here is within each of these three zones, through a series of decisions that might have had a logic to them, we've ended up in a situation in which we have full-throated opportunity markets. Let's start with early childhood, Zone 1. You might think Well, yeah, let me step back. The big development over the last century and longer is that we took the training function out of the family and located it in another institution. So it's a differentiation of training out of the family into another institution in schools and so forth. And you might think, well, that's wonderful. If you want to reduce the effects of the family, wouldn't we be better off taking that function out of the family and thereby reducing the effects of social origins? In principle, you might think that would have that effect. But something went wrong. And you have to bear in mind there are two ways you can differentiate a function out of the family. You could put it into a state-controlled set of services in which, in principle, a standardized training product could be delivered to everyone. Not a family-specific training product, but a standardized product. The state could decide to do that. Or you could do what the US did, which was in effect put it into the market. When you put it into the market, rather than into the state sector, it's going to be offered at different levels and price points, right? So you have high-quality training, costs more money. Low-quality training costs less money. All of a sudden, you've put opportunity on the market. So it's the way in which that differentiation happened that's consequential. We didn't differentiate the training function into the state, by and large. We differentiated it into the market sector. So you might say, well, you could always borrow, right? In this zone 1, in this early childhood sector. So as long as low-income families could borrow to make human capital investments in their children, all would be well, right? Well, there's very little opportunity, in fact, for borrowing of this sort. You can't go to a bank in the US and say, hey, lend me some money. I have this amazing kid. We make a human capital investment in that kid. She'll do wonderfully. There'll be boatloads of money to be had. So I'll be able to pay back that loan, no problem. Please forward the cash so I can make that investment in my kid and buy some high quality early childhood education. So far as I know, the bank would not deliver that loan. So what about middle childhood? You might think, well, now everything's just fine because that's where we start training kids in primary and secondary schools that are state controlled typically. And so that should have a standardizing effect, right? You know, early childhood education, that's basically a private sector in the US. And so you might have some problems of the sort that I just discussed. But when we go into zone 2, that's the public zone, right? Problem solved, right? Wrong. Why isn't it solved? We don't have public schools in the US. If you want high quality schooling in the US, you put money on the table. How do you put money on the table? High quality public schooling, you have to put money on the table. You gotta get into a fancy neighborhood where you have high quality public schools. How do you get into a fancy neighborhood? You either buy a house or you rent a place. How are you gonna buy a fancy house in a fancy neighborhood? You need money. You go to the bank and you say, I've got this great kid. I need to make some human capital investments in that kid. The only way I'm going to do so successfully is to get into this fancy neighborhood. Please give me the mortgage that I need so I can buy that house. And I'll be able to repay you because my kid is going to make boatloads of money if I can make that investment. They're not going to give you that loan. You get the loan if you have high income or a lot of wealth. So I have a picture here of Woodside Elementary. That's right next to where I live. It's one of the richest neighborhoods in the United States. This little highlighted sentence here says it's a hybrid public-private school because the district, like many in the area, get a good portion of its budget from parent and community donations. It's not a public school. It's a private school run by private contributions. It's a wonderful school. Okay, what about borrowing in zone 2? Well, I already said borrowing's unavailable. Mortgages are based on income and wealth, not the future earnings of the child. Not going to happen. What about zone 3 now? Early adulthood. So now it's all about getting into a good college, right? So colleges weigh in on who should be admitted to the ranks. And they take a look at the resume, basically, that's presented to them after the kid was processed by these primary institutions and secondary institutions. You put it all down on a big application. That's basically your resume. And then those are evaluated. They're supposed to be measures of merit. But basically what you do is you buy that resume by making those human capital investments in the primary and secondary sectors, in what I'm calling Zone 1 and Zone 2. And you can amass a beautiful, beautiful resume, which then is seen as conveying merit. How do you do this? I talked about how you do this. In the early childhood zone, you purchase high-quality childcare, high-quality preschool, high amenity and stress-free neighborhoods. In the middle childhood zone, you purchase extracurricular activities. We love those in the US. You have to volunteer a lot. That costs money. You have to set up your own charity. That costs money. After-school training, SAT prep, high-quality private or public primary and secondary schools. You need college consultants so that you can put together that nice-looking resume. These things all cost a lot of money. So it's basically, at the end of the day, a money laundering operation. Money's converted into a winning resume, and it's recast as merit. So that's the insidious part of it, right? The college admissions folks are just saying, well, look at all this merit here in this resume. It's amazing. But it took lots of money to convey that impression of merit. So we often worry about Zone 3 borrowing constraints. But the real worry, this is what I want to stress, the real worry is that children who couldn't participate in those Zone 1 and Zone 2 markets can't present the resumes that signal merit. So it's an access problem. Now, there is a late investment strategy. So what I'm saying is your main strategy when you're rich should make those early investments in Zone 1 and Zone 2 so you construct a resume that then will convey merit. That's your main strategy. But let's say you're a bad parent. You're rich, but you didn't make those Zone 1 and Zone 2 investments. You wanted to buy a fancy car and diamonds instead. And so you didn't invest in your kids. But then all of a sudden you said, oh my gosh, it's very late. And I want now my kids to get into college, a good one. Well, there is a late investment strategy for the very rich, for those with lots of money. There's a legal late investment strategy and an illegal late investment strategy. The legal late investment strategy is to make very large donations to elite schools. Many people do this. It's legal. Most large schools will say, like 2 or 3 years before your kid is going to be evaluated, don't give us any money. That would look bad. You can give money after the decision. You can give money well before the decision. So it can't be too late, right? But as long as you have the impression of arm's length, it'll all work. That's the legal way. Then there's the illegal way, which has gotten a lot of. I don't know if you follow the college admission scandal much here. My school participated in that. Many schools did. You buy a consulting service. Now, you need a lot of money to buy your way into these elite colleges. The legal way, millions and millions of dollars would be necessary to actually make it work. The illegal way, it's a bargain. You can do that for something more in the range of $500,000. So you can save some money. It is illegal. You buy the services of a consulting service and you can get in. But in all cases, these are just different ways in which money can be made to work. It's still the big point. It's all about money. So what's to be done? I want to start with some conventional approaches. The first is redistribution. So what would you do? You'd say, well, the genie's out of the bottle. We have markets for opportunity. Opportunity was supposed to be sacred. It should have been off the market, but we, for a whole host of reasons, have put it on the market. Nothing to be done about that, but we have to make it work. So how do you make it work? You give more money to low-income families so they can participate somewhat more equally in these opportunity markets. It's a capitulation to those markets. So that's one way. The second way is direct provision of services. So you say, actually, we're going to take opportunity out of the market. It can be undone. And so you equalize access to high-quality preschool, high-quality primary school, high-quality secondary school. You basically provide everyone high-quality training. Why don't we do those? A lot of it's about money. Both of those approaches cost serious money. You're either redistributing, which means you're going to tax more at the top and provide that money to those who are less well off, or you're going to tax people at the top and actually provide direct services, right? Either way, there's taxation happening at the top that's going to be opposed. And I should say there's also this relative advantage problem. As long as that redistribution doesn't disrupt the rank ordering of families, those at the top can still outcompete those beneath them. So I want to lay out another way. A lot of people would say, well, it's never going to happen because we're never going to tax people at the top more than we now do, or not substantially more, and then they give up. I mean, I think we should tax people at the top a lot more, substantially more. But I just want to say here that we ought not give up. If that's indeed off the table, there is another way. And I want to just show that other way with an example from Stanford University, how Stanford University might do it. But it's a more general illustration of what you could do if you're unwilling to spend the money. Okay, so here's how it could happen. Stanford could take applicants from the bottom quintile of the family income distribution, the poorest 1/5 of the country, put them into a pile. Then the second quintile, another pile. Third, a third pile. Fourth, a fourth pile. Fifth, a fifth pile. And then they select 1/5 of the class from each pile. So you run 5 separate competitions, right? The bottom quintile competition, the second, third, fourth, and fifth. And you make sure that from each quintile, you have 1/5 of the admitted kids. And suddenly it would be America's university, and you would have taken money out of the equation. You're just running competitions within each resource level, on the argument that that's the only way in which the competition can be fair. Let me give you a metaphor to convince you that that's fair. Let's say BMW wanted to select the best young race car drivers. They want to cultivate them for the future race car circuit. They want to identify the young ones who are great, the good drivers, right? And so they decide they're going to have a competition to do that. They want to identify those race car drivers who have a lot of talent in whom they should invest. So there are 3 types of competitions that they could run. The first would have the drivers bring their own cars to the track. So remember, these are young drivers, so their parents would be needed to build the cars for them that they could bring to the track. And then you could say, well, let the best, the person who wins that race, the driver of that car would be the best driver. That's one thing that BMW could do. And the analog would be allowing parents to buy opportunity, to use their money to construct the resumes that then are presented to colleges, and they decide that the winning resumes win. This would be like building cars. The parents get to build the cars for their kids, and the winning race car driver is then deemed the best race car driver. That's one option. I don't think BMW would take that one because it would all be about how good your race car is, right? It'd just be a measure of parental income. The second way they could go is to standardize the cars. Say, well, everyone has to deliver a 200 horsepower car, right? And then you could get the real talent to emerge because you standardize the cars. That's like providing the same quality education to all children, right? You standardize the training function, you standardize the car, and then real effort and talent can emerge. The third way is to run separate races for each horsepower level. You can say you can bring whatever car you want, but all 100 horsepower cars are going to be competing against each other, the 200 against each other, the 300 against each other. That's like sorting the applications into family income quintile. Same thing. I contend that BMW would take 2 or 3. They would never opt for one. Never opt for one if what they wanted to do was identify the best race car drivers. So that's all I'm suggesting we should do as well. We're not going to do 2 because that's very expensive. To give everyone a 500 horsepower car is expensive, or to give everyone high quality training is expensive. Evidently that's off the table. It shouldn't be, but it is. Here's a fallback, option 3, that wouldn't take any money. I'm running out of time. I'm going to skip this. But for those of you who love Romer, you can justify what I just suggested in Romerian terms. I want to conclude by talking about how you could implement that. I just gave you kind of a very simple implementation, but you could do this algorithmically. You could do this in a big data way. Here's how you do it. You set up an optimization problem in which you decide, what do we want to be our gross university product? Not the gross national product, but the gross university product. What does Stanford or Harvard or Yale want to produce? They want to produce kids who earn lots of money, evidently. We care about that. We want them to do well in science and deliver a lot of patents. We want doctoral degrees. We want them to be in public service occupations. So we just settle on what we want to be produced by our university. And then we choose weights on those various things. And then with past data, we can predict how to optimize that package of things we care about with input variables like grades or SAT scores, essay scores, and the like. And then that optimization problem could be run with family income constraints. So you could just say, of all the solutions, I only want those solutions in which the distribution of incoming students mimics the family income distribution in the US. I want it to be America's university. So Stanford could do that. So you could just run this formal optimization problem with constraints, with a family income constraint. The question that I'd like to ask is, how much would Stanford be harmed by running that optimization problem with that family income constraint as opposed to running it in an unconstrained way? Some people might say, oh, our gross university product is going to be grossly reduced if we impose that family income constraint. It's actually not the case. Here's some data from Raj Chetty's work, which shows that for that green line, it's very flat, which means that no matter how poor or rich your parents are, your expected earnings are about the same. So once if you select high quality, talented folks from poor backgrounds, their expected earnings are about the same. So we can get the same earnings with a distribution that mimics the family income distribution. Okay. Just a few more minutes. I apologize, I'm out of time, but I'm almost done. You might say, who cares about Stanford and what they might do? I think that's a fair question. The real important question is whether or not, if we did something like that, would it trigger a norm cascade? And this is arguably a moment in history in which there are lots of norm cascades. There's Me Too, there's same-sex marriage rights, there's Black Lives Matter. There are a lot of norm cascades in which relatively small events and nudges lead to bigger change. You might ask, what would happen if Stanford were to do what I just described? How might, for example, Harvard react? Well, they could say, we don't care what Stanford does. They're America's university, that's fine, but the fact of the matter is, merit is deeply, disproportionately to be found in the top 1%. That's just the way it is. And so that we admit large quantities of folks from the 1% just reflects where the merit is. We believe those resumes that are delivered to us. We don't think those resumes are constructed by money. We think they just reflect real talent. Now that's a hard right argument. And that's not the kind of circle that I think Harvard likes to run in. I don't think they'd make that argument. I think they'd capitulate. I think they'd do the same. So if that were to happen, if Stanford were to do this, it would spread to other selective educational institutions. It might spread to government sector. It might spread to all employers. And so, conclusion one, the problem is not just rising inequality. If we just let the rich buy diamonds and BMWs, we wouldn't have a mobility problem. We have a mobility problem because we also let the rich buy opportunity with their money. And conclusion two, because the problem isn't just rising inequality, we don't have to reduce inequality to make headway. We should, but those who say that's impossible, there is another way. So if you really believe in equal opportunity, there is another way. And so we should do that. So here's my final slide, my friendly amendment. inequality plus marketization is the root of social evil. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you. You can just stay put. Yeah, thank you, David. Because now we're going to have a short discussion. So I'm going to re-invite Kalle and Marianne to the stage together with David. It's always nice to listen to people who are really engaged into what they're doing and working on. So even if we're running a bit out of time, we still have the time to discuss a little bit. So, yeah. If you can just, super, stand around the tables. I feel like there's a certain distance here, so please come closer. And I was planning on starting to ask whether David and Marianne agreed on Kalle's message about an international inequality crisis, but I think I'm going to skip that question because you've already argued quite well for it already. But the concept of redistribution is very interesting, as David just showed. First of all, are you actually going to go forward with dividing into family income resources, the quintiles that you were talking about, David? Is that going to happen at Stanford? Just to start with an example.
I think it's a long shot. But
it's interesting.
Sometimes long shots pay off. I'm trying.
You're trying. Yeah. So you're starting to change the system already. Trying. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's an example of what could be called a pre-distributional reform, in which you try to change the institutions through which money is allocated, rather than redistribute in a direct and overt way that might be deemed by some as illegitimate. This is a pre-distributional reform that provides an example of one way forward.
Yeah, Marianne, you've been studying this in Norway as well, how merits or geographic belongings should run the way we're educated. What do you think about the ideas that David is presenting here?
I thought it was very thought-provoking,
Yeah.
but I also think that if you look at admission procedures in Oslo, I think many are thinking in some of the same way as you were describing now. So, for instance, in Oslo, they're starting a new, trying to get a new way to admit people to secondary schools. But of course, America is a much more extreme society than Norway, with much bigger problems with marketization. And I think it's also very shocking, the graph you showed, where the 1%, they dominate in the elite Ivy League universities. That's the sort of reality, but still it's a very important, they still feel that this is fair. And the reason they got there is that they are so clever, so intelligent, we're the top. So we're the top in everything. So it's also what one could call a very powerful way of legitimizing privilege.
Kalle?
I like the idea. I think it was very good, motivated, and it was clear what was happening. I have some thoughts that connect to this, that social mobility is one aspect, but say you had full social mobility and a huge inegalitarian society, there will still be an inegalitarian society. It's just that who occupies which position in that society differ. It's not inherited to the same extent. Northern European countries have higher social mobility than the US, much higher. So if you condition on your father's income, it's basically father's income that they have observation for, and then it's much more mobility. So the likelihood that you end up in the same income bracket as your father is much lower here than in the US. So the American dream is exactly what the name says. It is a dream.
An illusion.
Yeah, it is a dream that they hope for, but has never been, at least not in recent time, been the case. I will just say one thing in the end, that a class, this is class travels in a sense, that you jump from one class to another. And of course, the shorter the distance between the groups that you jump between, the easier it is to make the jump. So I think it's equally important for a lot of reasons. I like the idea, but it's also equally important to make the differences across groups smaller. So that you shouldn't have to take a jump from the first decile in the wage distribution to the 9th decile in the wage distribution in the US. That's 5 times the income, almost. And in Norway, it's twice the income. So that means that to make these jumps means less, and then you can sort of have more that you can allocate people according to interest and talents without so much consequences for their future income. And I think that is important.
David, you wanted to comment, and is the American dream dying? Or is it only possible with lots of money?
It's definitely has long been dead.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way.
Okay, so it's gone.
It's gone.
Yeah.
But I'd like to respond to the very provocative comment that were we to initiate this reform as regards mobility, it would have no implications or limited implications for the actual distribution of income. And I think there's a strong argument to the effect that that's not the case. And I'd be interested in your reactions to it. So here's how the logic would play out. And it's all about rent extraction, right? In effect, what's happening in the US is that the rich are protected from competition from the poor. That is, they have basically a guaranteed ticket to those sorts of institutions that then generate lots of income. And that protection from competition is generating extremely high returns to their elite educations. And so if we expose them to full competition, if we corrected for this type of market failure, it would reduce the returns. And hence could have an equalizing effect. And I think there's a general problem with the rise of rent generating opportunities at the top of the income distribution. Like CEO pay would be, at least in some countries, another example of returns in excess of the actual marginal product of the individual. And you could engage in institutional reform of various sorts so as to correct that market failure. And so that kind of reform, call it pre-distributional reform, call it reform that corrects for market failure, that kind of reform that often speaks to issues of mobility will have implications for the total amount of inequality.
So I agree completely to that. So I didn't mean to be provocative. I meant to be complementary to the...
It's allowed to be provocative.
Take, for example, the education revolution of my own vintage, the sort of kids in the 1960s. So at that time, they expanded a lot for higher education. None of us had parents with higher education or rich parents at all. There was an expansion of the schooling system in Norway in that case. And many went for the first time to the university and so on. It was I think it's very common for my vintage to have that kind of experience. And of course, that supply supports exactly what you say, that the supply of highly educated people that reduce the sort of premium on the skill premium on higher education. But in addition to that, if you compare with other countries, there are also compressing factors that you have more sort of regulated wages here by national negotiations between large union associations and so on, and that this has an additional effect. Yeah. But South Korea, for example, had a huge subsidization of schooling programs with a similar compressed wage distribution to Northern European countries.
Marianne, you asked for a comment.
Just a general comment. I don't think there's an opposition between studying mobility and studying inequality, because they sort of intertwine. Just an interesting example to that. Now, it was a suggestion that you should double the number of positions in Norwegian doctor education. So this is a sort of would have consequences like you talk about, because the supply has been very low, or the number very low, 400 in Norway altogether. So this is an example, I would say, which could have consequences.
Yeah, I would like to draw in a very popular question among the audience, which is social inequality has become racialized in the current Norwegian political debate. Which impact could this have on the ambition to redistribute wealth? That's a big question. Who feels inclined to answer? I'm not looking at you now, David. Kalle?
You said race.
Racialized, I suppose it's because we see that the growth of child poverty, for instance, is mainly among families with immigrant backgrounds. And how do you see ways to redistribute wealth when this is part of the equation?
I think racism is used against redistribution everywhere. For example, take the US over favorite country. No, I'm kidding. The states, after slavery was abolished, and so the blacks were not evenly distributed over different districts. And those states, many welfare policies in many states in the US are locally determined. And these states where a large fraction of blacks have much less generous welfare policies towards the whole population in that area. So racism and prejudices of that kind, I think, is really bad for. I think the United States is very useful to study for that reason, because U.S. had almost a Northern European development from 1945 to way up in the 60s. They're expanding welfare state. They had the lowest wage inequality for periods, much lower than between the wars. But then it turned in the 60s and 70s, and that was basically racism. Gillens have written very well about these things, and also historians have written very well about it. So this is our experience that should warn us that we should use these things. I think we use the concept much more sort of race, ethnic background. Who cares? Why don't we just have systems that don't use these words at all to minimize this effect?
But if you look at the income differences or the wealth...
And treat people... I think this, who knows who are sort of ethnicity of, we look alike, but who knows? And who cares? And who should care? Nobody. So I think we should be much more concerned about try to be more colorblind here. But I think it is when a welfare program benefits a certain group with distinct characteristics, and they can be considered an out-group, then it easily gets mobilization against that type of program. So the recipe should be universalistic programs where you can't distinguish specific groups to the same extent. They are more expensive, but they benefits us all, and they tend to be more popular. I think that is one way, but I think it's a good question. I don't know the answer, how to do it. I'm a little bit optimistic, more than average optimistic about this, but I think the first step is to stop using these concepts.
Marianne, there is a question here that I think another panel is going to be happy to answer as well, but I would like to ask you the same question, and maybe also David. Do we have any strong evidence about welfare policies that help children from poor families succeed in school and thereby increase their life chances?
I think the short answer to that question is that there have been some policies, efforts during the last, let's say, 30 years or something, and I think the main answer is that they all have failed. Okay. So there aren't, as I can recall at least, any examples, good examples of such policies that have reached their goals.
David, how is that picture in the US? Are there any programs to help children from poor families to succeed in school? Except for scholarships for, let's say, athletes.
So I think one of the big findings that comes out of the quasi-experimental and other literatures, new ways to detect in very compelling ways the actual causal effects of an intervention. One of the big findings that came out of it, and I'm a bit embarrassed to convey it, but here goes: money matters. So when you deliver money to low-income populations through, say, the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is one of the biggest anti-poverty interventions in the U.S., or through the Child Tax Credit, or through so-called food stamps, cash or near-cash interventions that deliver more money to low-income populations lead to higher school outcomes, higher earnings among the children. Money matters.
Yeah.
That is the big contribution of social science to date.
Yeah.
So I think my short answer would be that I think targeted programs like that are very sensitive to racism. So is there something special with these families? Single mother programs, for example, in the US, were the first to be cancelled when there was a cut down in welfare. So you have very specific programs for specific groups are very vulnerable to the sympathies in the population of that group. And that's one reason why it often fails.
I see that the time is running away from us, and I would like to ask you also how to measure poverty, mobility, and inequality in the 21st century. Because I've understood from all three of you that this is not that easy as we might think it should be. Kalle, you were talking about the complexity of different numbers and statistics. Marianne, I think you would agree as well that this is not easy to measure because a lot of the taxing systems are difficult to see through. And David, these are questions that you're dealing with every day. And let's start with you, and this is going to be your final words for this panel. How to go about measuring these different parametric values?
Yeah, we have a big problem in the US on the measurement side. We have lots of big problems.
Well, one of them.
But one of the big problems is a simple data problem. And the comparison with what's in play, say, here and other Scandinavian countries is very, very substantial. So we often will go to the data from European countries where the data is much better to try to get a sense of what the effect of a particular intervention would be. And then we do what I would call the leap of faith. We say that, well, if that same intervention were deployed in the US, it would likely yield the same result. That's a huge leap of faith because the context shift is massive. But nonetheless, because we have such poor data, we nonetheless make that leap of faith. So we have a real problem on the data front.
Kalle.
So I think here I have very strong views, and I think there's too much measurement without theory. And that I think there should be a very clear question. This is the question we're going to address. Then we find a measure that's suitable for sort of getting the essence of that problem or answering the question that they raised in the... And then we need to have an interaction between the measures and the theory or basically the question you are interested in. That there is no measure that fits everything. And I think it is in the inequality discussions too much emphasis on one measure that should fit for all problems. For example, if you're interested in inequality in power, then I think you have to investigate that with a specific measure that captures power. And then you have to elaborate on that. If you are interested in inequality in opportunities, David's basic thing, then maybe it's a different measure that will capture that best. And it would be strange if it was the same measure. It would be strange. And, but the whole debate has gone so that that we're going to stick to one measure should fit everything, and there's no way that that's going to happen. And no real social... scientist is a too serious word, but a really investigator, a researcher wouldn't stick to that if that person were completely honest. That we sort of work much more to find measures that will eliminate the problem that you address.
Good. Marianne, final remark.
I agree with that, of course. There's no one measure that measures inequality. So and I looked at some different measures in this presentation. I'll also say that I've worked a lot with developing a sort of class concept aimed at looking at different problems. So if you, for instance, want to study inequalities in schools, then those with sort of cultural class background, they score the highest. If you want to measure economic inequalities, then there are these with certain positions in the economic sphere or much money or wealth that score the highest. So I fully agree. You have to sort of develop measures directed at your problem.
Our time has run out. We're going to have a coffee break. So even though there's no beers coming up during this break, Kalle, I hope that all three of you will be available for questions, because the audience has asked lots of questions. And as I said earlier, several of them are also suitable for the next panel discussions, so they're not going to go away. But we didn't have time to ask them all. So I hope that all three of you will be available during the break and to talk with the audience. And you can all go and have some coffee, some croissants, some fruit. And we will reconvene here at 11:05 sharp. That's when I'm starting up again. So thank you very much to the panel. A huge applause for all three of them. And thank you for you. Thank you. Thank you.